Na entrevista de hoje, o Clube da Caçamba conversou com o doutor em Psicologia e professor da Universidade de Nevada, Steven Reis. Steven Reis é um conhecido e renomado psicólogo clínico e pesquisador das ciências comportamentais contextuais, tendo contribuído para a área com o desenvolvimento da terapia de aceitação e compromisso, ACT, e a teoria das molduras relacionais, RFT. Steven também fez extensas contribuições para a área da análise do comportamento aplicada a problemáticas socioambientais, sendo coautor do livro Environmental Problems, Behavior Solutions, com John Kohn. Convidamos o Dr. Reis para uma conversa sobre seu trabalho na área das problemáticas socioambientais e sobre como a ciência comportamental e a psicologia podem contribuir para mudanças sociais envolvendo a defesa do meio ambiente. Esta é a primeira parte da entrevista. Espero que aproveitem.
So, in the first place, Stephen, you are a very well-known researcher on behavioral science. You are very well-known from your contribution to relational frame theory and acceptance and commitment therapy. May know is that, some years ago, at the 80s, you were also very active in the environmental psychology area and research. I wrote a book in 1980 with John Kohn called Environmental Problems, Behavioral Solutions.
Yes.
So my first question, I think that is, what made you interested in this area at the first place?
Has tried to organize things for a better future wherever I go. And I was, even before I was a graduate student in psychology, I was a political organizer and was trained by a very well-known labor organizer in California. And the project I worked on was called the Clean Environment Act, which was the first citizen established initiative where the citizens themselves put the vote for a law of the state, and if it passes, it's a law. Not every state has this in the United States, but California did, where I live. But this was before Watergate, before people knew how corrupt the system was. I got an early education because Standard Oil of California organized the effort. We were very popular because people wanted the change. But after they came in, corrupt things, but also just, it is kind of corruption, but, almost trotting out their politicians like puppets to say things that were true. I may give you an example of what was in the initiative. We banned DDT. And so then the farmers will come out and say, oh my God, we'll all starve. We won't have any food. The insects will eat everything. We put a restriction on nuclear power until you can safely store the waste from nuclear power. At the time, Gulf Oil was producing Atomic, a very, very big maker of nuclear power plants. And they would trot out their engineers and say, oh, your lights will go off, or, you will live in the darkness. Oh my God. We restricted the mileage on cars until the output from the tailpipes were better, changed the fuel formulations, which at the time were very, very polluting. This is 50 years ago. Well, you can imagine the reason I know it was corrupt is it's sort of like what we now are used to. The memos inside the company leaked, but no paper would publish them. We knew what they were doing. And they said things like, oh, we'll get Ronnie to come out on May 6th and say this. Well, Ronnie was Ronald Reagan, the person who then became the president, who was the governor of California. And he was treating him like a pawn, head of Standard Oil. Well, so it was a very good lesson. And I still had great heart for it. So when I went to West Virginia University, and it was a behavior analytic clinical program, I wanted to learn about clinical psychology, but really what I wanted to do was further the environmental work I was doing. So I thought, well, let's bring research to this. Having, by the way, when they did all that, our initiative lost horribly. But what I learned is that from it was that groups are what matter, not individuals. That you have to expect opposition, and that you have to organize such a strong group and such a strong community that when the built-in resistance happens, you are able to overcome. And really, although I have hardly ever said this out loud, I'm a political practitioner. I was before I became a psychologist. Why did I focus on the environmental problem? Because I thought it was the biggest problem we had to face of our time. I still think that.
Yeah.
But after doing my research, and I did research on how to protect parks and how to help people be more environmentally minded, and then my dissertation was on those little notes in your bill that says how much you used last month, how much last year. Mm-hmm. I was the first person to study that, and it went around the world. The second person came in, and the public utility commissions, the people who decide how the energy companies behave, put it into a few states, and then it went across the whole United States and went across the whole world. And it saves 2 or 3%, not very much. But I feel pretty good about it. Maybe I had 3% of an impact from my dissertation. But when I went, I'm sorry for such long answers, but you'll have to restrain me. When I went to be a faculty member, it became very obvious to me that I would get no students, I'd have no grants, and I'd have to almost retrain as an environmental engineer even to be listened to. And by the way, I wouldn't be listened to. I did my research, and I would meet with the companies, and I could have just, doorknob. That if groups are the only thing that matters, how was I going to be a psychologist and a professor, which is what I wanted to be? I could quit and be a political organizer. But anyway, I just thought the opposition was so great, I didn't see a solution. The other part is that all I had at the time was direct contingencies. I did behavior analysis circa 1985. That's it. And so I did a study on giving little to people if they saved energy, or what about messages to remind people, and on it went. Well, I became a clinical psychologist, but I went into psychotherapy almost as a second choice because I had no alternative, I thought, to be able to either stay what I've been trained to do or leave. Now is different because now I think we have a different alternative. Now I think we can bring psychology, behavior analysis to it, not just to deal with environmental distress. That's fine. That's good. I'm fine with that. Or with young people not wanting to have children and all these kinds of things. Okay, that's fine. But how about creating a world in which behavioral science is part of the solution to these big problems? Environmental problems now are just one. We have, because of that, immigration coming, massive amounts. People aren't going to just stay and die. They're going to run. Where are they going to run? You don't have enough guns to shoot enough people to keep them from running to your country if you've destroyed their lands. I mean, or is that what we're going to do? We're just going to stand at the border and mow them down with machine guns? Really? No, I don't think we will. Well, okay, well, then you see what happens. We've had already immigration at high levels in many countries, and we know what happens politically. It's very disruptive to people. It's very hard for people not to feel threatened by that. Around the world, we're seeing a move to the right, and people say, oh, no, stay out, stay out. It's very primitive and evolutionary, I understand it, and then economic disparities, how about that? So when you look at the television And you see people talking about the environmental problem. Almost never do you see a psychologist unless they're talking about young people being depressed. I'm okay with talking about young people being depressed or anxious, but come on, how about solving the problem? It's a behavioral problem. It isn't just a technological problem.
Yeah.
And we either just wait for the miracle of, physics or something. And, and I'm supportive of all the kind of things we're doing in that area. But even then, you see the resistance of, should we drive an electric car, or what about our airplanes and so on? So one of the things I think we need to do now is take the process information that behavioral psychology, behavior analysis has developed about language and cognition, its impact on what we call emotion, sense of self, attention, motivation, overt behavior, relationships, all those kinds of things. It's farther along than it was 50 years ago. And apply them now to these social problems. I made one of my first efforts in the book called Pro-Social, and which is looping back to how it started in a way. But it doesn't have that much data yet, and we really still have to dial it in. We need to get people like yourself, I think, organizing, but also doing the research. And I do see some really good indications. For example, that psychological flexibility is very, very helpful in helping people to deal with the degree of behavior change that is needed to step up to the challenge we now face. And I won't see it. You will. And you're going to see it at very high levels. Not just awful things, wonderful things. The robots are coming. Yes, they are. AI could be wonderful or horrible. And you have to figure that out, but let's groups and not wait for the politicians and the business owners to do it, because they're always playing their own game for their own benefits. I'm not cynical about them. There are good people who are billionaires, but they are also they've done things that I wouldn't do that way. I've met a number of them. I know some of them. What would you do if you're a billionaire? You wouldn't be yourself, I'll tell you that. You're not. It would change you a lot. So don't wait for the businesses and billionaires and politicians to fix it. We, as a human community, need to fix it. Behavioral scientists, that's what they say we study. So the journey that behavior analysis has been on, and the small part of it that I'm part of, is now even more relevant than ever.
So I think you answered many questions with one answer. So I have the personal impression that on psychology, not even only on behavior analysis, the environmental issues and the study of environmental issues is being neglected, today also. Our project, sometimes, people see the project and say, well, I don't think that this is psychology. It doesn't seem like psychology. Well, considering, and you talk about relational frame theory and how we can, knowing about language and cognition, trying to create psychological flexibility. How do you think that is there a specific frame, specific frames you can train? How we can use RFT to promote pro-environmental behaviors?
Yes. Well, this is the larger issue of how do we create, and when I say language and cognition, I mean thought of the way a naturalistic science like behavior analysis is thinking of. So not magic, not a little person in your head, but as the cooperative social behavior that it started out to be. It became a problem-solving behavior. It's not all of us, it's just one repertoire, but it's a very important one. Well, I think we need to take core things that we've learned from RFT. Let me just give you some examples. Well, first, let me remind you that your cognitive capabilities are unimaginably vast, but the ruts that you live in are very few. When I do the math of how many relations, if you just take events that could be related and their attributes and all possible relations that could apply, and all the attributes, all the verbs, all the attributes, and all the relations, and have a simple sentence be this with its attributes or is related in this way to that and its attributes. If you do the math on that, there's more potential rules in your head than there are molecules in the universe. So you are basically living in an infinite space of behavioral possibility. But most people are living in a rut that's so new idea. It's yes, but it's right back. I'll give you an example. If you frame, not just explain, but show up behaviorally for the listener, you're more likely to see behavior change around this new, I'll say rule, this new verbal formulations. Here's another one. If you are able to create an emotional response, a physiological, motivative response, and give an outlet, like trying to scare people into action, will leave some people to move that way and other people to move the other way. They will deny what you say. There's old literature on that. I think the bottom line is, I think we need scores of studies on the behavioral impact of persuasive verbal material. Originally we hoped the IRAP would do that back when, I was involved in those discussions before Dermot even started that, but I think it has some technical problems. I think there's some solutions. So I've tried some solutions that I think maybe are a little better, but I don't only emphasize antecedents, however. Verbal behaviors, if it's not part of a social community where you're also differentially reinforcing and also creating the psychological space for the behavior change, I don't think it's as likely to work. So, change is local, but the issue is universal. So how do we do that? Well, I think we're going to have to research how to do that. And I'm concerned to hear that some people are telling you, Marcello, that, this is not psychology. That's pretty frustrating because, of course, it's psychology. If not us, who? And if not now, when? So.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I don't know. Maybe people don't put in the coordination psychology environment yet. Maybe. It's a difficult...
psychology. One reason. Psychology this has to do with human behavior. So anything that people do is psychology. And the cool thing about what we've been doing, I have to say, in the CBS contextual behavioral science work on cognition, a new way forward. Skinnerian operants only take you to a mental age of 2 or 3, and that's not enough for what we're doing. RFT can get right in there, and look at what's happened. People have not wrapped their head around what's happened. AI has killed normal cognitive science, killed it. DeepSeek doesn't give a darn about bottom-up versus top-down thinking, hot and cold cognitions. It's reinforcement learning. And it is the best AI tools we have. So implicit in AI and what's happening right now is the victory of behavioral psychology but without anybody giving it credit or even mentioning it, hardly. They will say reinforcement learning, but nobody seems to mention, oh, yeah. So what I've been doing to say, oh, you didn't listen to us 25, 30, 40 years ago. Nobody wants to hear that. But what I'm doing instead is trying to create bridges to the AI labs to take what we've learned from T and what we've learned from the process-oriented work inside ACT and contextual behavioral science and third wave CBT. And then put that into a greater attention to how to motivate and sustain behavior change in these social problem areas, and area is a really big one. I think immigration is another one. Diversity, equity, inclusion is another one. It's made smarter about how to changes than just go out and wag fingers at people. Because, of course, what they do is they wag another finger back at you, and it's not the index finger. So behavior change is hard at a cultural level. And so cultural evolution needs to be linked to psychological evolution and to biological evolution. And, one of the things, behavioral psychology is an evolutionary perspective. I think the interconnection from the internet, a chance of creating community that has a culture that's fast enough and flexible enough to step up to the challenges now, where change has to happen fast. We can't wait another 50 years on the environmental problems. We wasted the first 50 years. And I was there on the first Earth Day, and anyone who did any amount of research could see this day. Skinner's last words were on selection and retention across levels of analyses. And I think the interconnection from the internet, a chance of creating community that has a culture that's fast enough and flexible enough to step up to the challenges now, where change has to happen fast. We can't wait another 50 years on the environmental problems. We wasted the first 50 years. And I was there on the first Earth Day, and anyone who did any amount of research could see this day. But they just wanted to burn their assets first and get the money out. Then we can solve it later, some other way. So it's going to take all hands on deck. I do think that, but the fact that psychological flexibility applies gives us a lesson inside behavior analysis, behavioral psychology. If we dig down to the processes that motivate and change people and keep pushing, and then take what you've learned in community and together, let's work on these problems fast.
Gostou do conteúdo? Então deixe um like no vídeo, comente, compartilhe com amigos e se inscreva no canal.